Most people refrigerate food automatically. You come home from the store, open the fridge, and start putting things inside without thinking twice. Eggs, tomatoes, bread, butter, cold equals fresh. That's the assumption most people grow up with. But here's the strange part. Some foods actually get worse in the fridge. Worse texture, less flavor, shorter usefulness. And long before modern refrigeration became normal, people already knew this, especially communities that relied more on practical food storage than convenience. That's one reason Amish kitchens still fascinate people, because they often preserve food differently. Not randomly, not carelessly, deliberately. And once you understand why certain foods are left out on purpose, you start looking at your own kitchen very differently. So instead of refrigerating everything automatically, let's go through 20 foods that often work better outside the fridge, and why keeping them cold sometimes creates more problems than people realize. Okay, let's start with tomatoes. This is honestly one of the biggest mistakes people make. Cold temperatures actually damage the texture, you know. The inside turns kind of grainy, and the flavor just becomes dull. That rich tomato taste, it fades away really quickly in the fridge. Keeping them at room temperature, though, makes them softer, juicier, and way more flavorful. That's exactly why traditional kitchens would often just leave them out completely. Now, let's talk about potatoes. These absolutely should not be refrigerated. Cold temperatures convert potato starch into sugar a lot faster, and that totally changes both the flavor and the texture. Potatoes end up tasting oddly sweet, and their cooking quality changes too. A cool, dark place actually works much better for storing them. That's why root cellars existed long before refrigerators were around. Now, onions. Here's another food people refrigerate unnecessarily. Onions just absorb moisture inside the fridge, which softens them faster and encourages spoilage. What really matters here is dry airflow, not cold temperatures. That's why, for generations, people hung onions in cool storage areas. Now garlic, same problem. Moisture ruins it faster than room temperature ever would. Garlic really needs airflow and dryness, not sealed cold environments. That's actually why refrigerated garlic often sprouts or softens so quickly. Now bread. People constantly refrigerate bread thinking it makes it last longer. Technically it can, but it also makes bread stale faster. The cold changes the starch structure. That's why refrigerated bread often feels dry and unpleasant quickly. Bread boxes existed for a reason. Now butter. This surprises people the most. Modern households refrigerate all butter automatically, but many traditional kitchens left small amounts out constantly. Salted butter especially can remain usable at room temperature for reasonable periods when covered properly. That's why butter crocks existed long before refrigeration became common. Now eggs. This one depends heavily on the country. In many places outside the United States, eggs are commonly stored outside the fridge. Why? Because washing methods differ. Natural protective coatings matter. Fresh, unwashed eggs behave differently than heavily processed supermarket eggs. That's why older farming communities often kept eggs at room temperature without issue. Now, bananas. Cold temperatures damage them quickly. The peel darkens, texture changes, flavor suffers. Bananas naturally do better at room temperature. The fridge interrupts normal ripening. Now, honey, this definitely doesn't belong in the fridge. Cold temperatures cause crystallization much faster. Honey naturally stores extremely well already. That's one reason it remained valuable for centuries. Dry, stable, long-lasting, no refrigeration needed. Now coffee. People argue about this constantly, but, refrigerators create moisture, and coffee absorbs surrounding smells extremely easily. That damages flavor. A cool, dry cupboard usually works far better than refrigeration. Now hot sauce. Many hot sauces stay perfectly usable outside the fridge after opening. The vinegar and salt content already help preservation significantly. That's why restaurants often leave bottles sitting out constantly. Now, peanut butter. Natural peanut butter behaves differently from heavily processed versions, but standard peanut butter generally stores fine in cupboards. Cold temperatures also make it harder to spread. That's why many people leave everyday jars outside refrigeration entirely. Now, apples. This one surprises people because apples do last longer refrigerated, but traditional storage methods often relied on cool cellars instead, not direct refrigeration. Cool, stable conditions mattered more than freezing cold temperatures. Now, melons before cutting. Whole melons generally do not need refrigeration. Once sliced, completely different story, but whole melons naturally store well outside the fridge initially. That's why older kitchens often kept them on counters or shelves. Now avocados before ripening. Cold temperatures slow ripening dramatically. That's useful later, but terrible if the avocado is still hard. That's why people often leave avocados out intentionally until ripe. Now basil. This one gets damaged by cold very easily. Leaves darken, texture changes. Fresh basil behaves more like flowers than sturdy vegetables. Many people keep basil in water at room temperature instead. Now chocolate. This surprises people because people think refrigeration protects it. But cold temperatures create condensation once removed. That affects texture and appearance. Chocolate stores better in cool, dry spaces, not necessarily refrigerators. Now, soy sauce. This is heavily preserved already. Salt content matters. Many soy sauces remain perfectly stable outside refrigeration for long periods after opening. That's why restaurant tables constantly leave them out. Now, vinegar-based condiments, mustard, some salad dressings, pickled items. Acidity helps preserve them naturally. That's one reason traditional preservation methods relied heavily on vinegar in the first place. Finally, cured meats in certain situations. This depends heavily on the product, but many traditional cured meats historically survived without modern refrigeration because curing itself acted as preservation. Salt, drying, airflow. Those methods existed centuries before refrigerators. Now step back for a moment, because this isn't really about avoiding refrigerators completely. That's not the point. The point is understanding food differently. Modern kitchens made people assume colder always equals better. But traditional storage focused more on matching foods with the conditions they naturally handled best. Cool, dry, dark, airflow. Those things mattered just as much as refrigeration. That's why old food storage systems looked so different. Root cellars, pantries, hanging storage, butter crocks, dry shelves. People designed kitchens around how foods actually behaved, not just around cold temperatures. And once you understand that, a lot of modern habits suddenly look unnecessary. People refrigerate foods automatically now, not because they researched it, because it became habit, but habits aren't always optimal, especially once convenience replaces understanding. That's one reason Amish food storage continues attracting attention, not because it's magical, because it's intentional. Simple systems built around observation and practicality. They learned how foods behaved naturally, which foods needed cold, which foods needed dryness, which foods lasted better in cellars than refrigerators. That knowledge mattered more before modern refrigeration. But surprisingly, much of it still matters now because flavor matters, texture matters, shelf life matters, and some foods genuinely perform better outside cold storage. That doesn't mean refrigerators are bad, they're incredibly useful, but modern kitchens often overuse them, and once you realize that, you start treating foods differently. Tomatoes taste better, bread lasts differently, potatoes cook differently, everything changes slightly once storage changes too. And maybe that's the most interesting part. The Amish didn't avoid refrigeration randomly. They simply kept using methods that already worked long before modern convenience changed how everyone stored food. And once you see those methods in practice, you realize some foods never needed refrigeration nearly as much as people assumed.